I am glad I'm living in a time where full frontal male nudity is completely acceptable these days. Dong Watch 2019.
Welcome back to Shat on TV Watchmen, the unofficial podcast companion piece to the hit HBO series Watchmen. I'm one of your hosts, Gene Lyons, and alongside me are my two co-hosts, the King Bee.
You have been made the tool of the egotistical rich in America.
And Roger Roper.
All right, dimwits, on with the show.
And this is our deep dive episode where we look back on this week's episode of Watchmen and provide our thoughts and analysis, plus the top listener emails for the week. This week's episode was entitled Martial Feats of Comanche Horsemanship. Guys, what'd you think?
Well, I don't feel that it really lives up to the grandiose nature of the title of the show. But as I sat down to skim through and soak up the performances a second and third time, I know there's a lot to be seen and heard in the world building that's taken place. It's still the best thing on TV right now.
Yeah, I agree with the B. Some people have labeled this a filler episode. I wonder if that's because so many mysteries and questions were presented in the premiere. For me, like, I didn't view it that way. I liked it because part of the fear of going into a Lindelof series is, especially like with Lost or even The Leftovers, there's a lot of like unresolved plot paths or too many mysteries that are introduced without any kind of resolve. So I thought this episode did a good job of confirming some of our suspicions in episode 1, presenting some new ones, expanding the world, and progressing the plot forward. So ultimately, if I look back at, after 9 episodes and say, was this my favorite one? No. But like B said, it's still the best thing on TV right now.
I think so often we look back at a series as a whole, especially one if, like The Watchmen is reported, is only going to be one season. And you go, oh shit, episode 2 set everything up. And you look back and you go, holy shit. And I think in this one, with Will Reeves in the handcuffs, he's saying, I told you everything. You just weren't listening. And I'm like, that's going to be this episode. I have a gut feeling that something happened and things were discussed in this episode that we just didn't catch. It felt much more straightforward to me than episode 1, but also much less Lindelof. Raj, you mentioned that, there's a common complaint about Lindelof leaving things too open-ended. This one answered a lot of questions. And unfortunately, though, along with that, some of the Lindelof things I like seem to have escaped. I think some of the maturity seems to have left the series, at least in this episode. And it's been replaced with what I typically expect from a comic book series. We saw a lot of like fast action and like even the music was a little more up tempo and like modern. And the lingering feeling I get is that I can't decide like whether this episode was telling us that history is doomed to repeat itself and that these cycles are still in motion from the past, or if it was just trying very hard to connect with the 2009 Watchmen movie.
There is definitely a vibe. Sister Night seems to have her own theme song now that cues up every time she goes into super detective mode. If that first episode is really about the wild animals that inhabit this world, this episode seemed to be a lot more about the landscape. You get the scene with the newsstand, the scene with the trailer park. I think there's just a lot more background being painted here rather than the animals, which is why you show up at the zoo.
This is a cautionary tale of humans being doomed to repeat the same mistakes, right? Or plans set in motion to what happens when the pendulum swings all the way back to the left. The same problems are going to arise, or we end up doing the same things that we did when the pendulum was swinging the other way. So Lindelof, I mean, I would like to think, like you said, he's a little bit more mature than just giving us, oh, you guys want Watchmen? Here's Watchmen set in 2019. Like, I really hope that's not it. I don't think it is. I do think, though, it is more of a cautionary tale of human nature.
Well, we're going to talk about that on this episode. And in addition to that, we're also going to talk about the character of Looking Glass and some of the parallels we see with Rorschach from the graphic novel. Also talk about Will Reeves, the mystery behind him, and whether he's aligned with some other forces that we haven't seen yet. We're going to talk about police brutality and just the overall depiction of police and vigilantes in the show. We'll also talk about the Crawford house. Roger has dug very deep into some of the things that we saw in the Crawford house and what they might tell us about what the future has in store for us. And Raj's also going to tell us a little bit about Ozymandias and the world that he's inhabiting, whether it's even in the same time frame. And finally, we'll end it off with a couple odds and ends, weird things that we noticed, and of course, listener mail. We got a ton more listener mail. Thanks everybody for writing in at host@shatontv.com. Again, if you've never listened to the podcast before, you're not familiar with it, we are doing everything in buckets. So we're not going to break down the scenes scene by scene. Instead, we're going to talk about bigger ideas like the ones I just described. So kicking it off, I do want to talk about this history repeating idea, starting with that Hooded Justice, I guess, miniseries that's on TV that everyone's watching, Good Guys and Bad. It felt very Watchmen 2009 to me. It was kind of, I don't want to call it hokey because I did like the Watchmen movie, but the action, sped up and slowed down, very graphic. What'd you guys think of that?
Yeah, I like to. I took the same take. Like the colors were very saturated in that same Zack Snyder similar viewpoint. One little odds and ends, that was actually a depiction of the scene that Hollis Mason wrote in his book Under the Hood. So when he's describing the introduction or the origin story, when Hooded Justice first came onto the scene, that scene is what we saw in American Hero Story. And again, this is the Watchmen world set in 2019. Of course, I'm going to draw parallels between what is happening in our world as the same as what is happening in this world. And you could almost say that this American Hero Story is in the same bucket as, or can be compared to, did you guys watch the O.J. Simpson American Crime Story or the death of Giovanna Versace? How it's kind of like an over the top, kind of bullshit exploration. Like, I kind of feel like that's what they were kind of poking fun at, while also doing a little meta with, hey, this is what Zack Snyder's, 2009 Watchmen depiction was.
I mean, yeah, it's definitely a take on those shows, sort of mishmash with the True Hollywood Story shows that used to be aired, along with Unsolved Mysteries, because ultimately they don't know the identity of this person. And this is supposed to be the big expose. It's trash TV for the masses.
All the people, like the shopkeeper and everything in this Hooded Justice scene, when he actually starts going berserk and stabbing people and crushing their heads with registers, nobody seems really happy about it.
Well, one of the things I think is really interesting that's been a common theme from the book to the movie and now to this show is that every vigilante, regardless of how good or bad they are, really embraced and enjoyed and relished the violence that they inflicted on others. And one of the things that I started to key in on back in the day when I read the book was that we're just lucky these guys chose good, but it seems that good is the mask they're hiding behind because really they just want to hurt somebody.
And somebody who believes they want to hurt somebody, or at least is using that as a motivation to pass legislation, is Senator Keene. And this is really critical to understanding Watchmen as a series. The Keene Act was a national law that was passed in 1977 by the United States Congress. This is in the comic book universe, not actual law, that outlawed costumed adventuring. And so John David Keene, the senator, he passed it, and it immediately made illegal any form of vigilantism by costumed adventurers, except for those who worked for the U.S. government.
I don't think it's John that we see in the show. We see his son. We see Junior.
It's his son, but if you'll recall, in the newsstand, one of the things that the guy says is that's his fucking clone, which could be a colloquialism or it could be a very telling statement.
Another callback we see is the play that's being put on for Ozymandias. It's called The Watchmaker's Son. Raj talked about it in the last episode. We get to finally see this play put on. It's fantastic. Jeremy Irons really at his best. And if you are not familiar with this, what's going on in front of you on this stage, again, I keep thinking of people who didn't read the graphic novel and you're like, what the fuck is happening here? This is Dr. Manhattan's origin story. So Dr. Manhattan is kind of this omnipotent being who now is kind of living on Mars. He's gone beyond the bounds of Earth. But we do get to see Dr. Manhattan's origin story here. That is how he became Dr. Manhattan. He didn't burn to death in a chamber. He was changed and reassembled himself out of nature. All right, a couple other things that we saw in this episode that are callbacks to the graphic novel or possibly hints that things are repeating themselves. The psychic squid reference was spelled out explicitly for us. If there's any doubt that the raining baby squids had anything to do with the psychic squid and what the psychic squid is all about, it's there right out in the open. This squid was unleashed upon Manhattan by Adrian Veidt in order to scare the people of the world into working together.
One thing about the squid was we also learned that it's not just happening or it's not isolated only to Tulsa, but it's happening across the globe, right? It's in other countries, other major cities. So I thought that was a great callback. And again, they're doing this all at the Newsstand, which was also a throwback to the novel and the movie.
One of my favorite parts of the Newsstand scenes that took place in the book. In the book, it's an older man that's running the newsstand, an older white guy, and a younger black kid who's just reading the comic books and not paying for them. And throughout the entire book, as they cut back to this newsstand, this old man's giving this young man shit and giving him a hard time for whatever's going on in this conversation or that. In the end, when there is a large explosion that takes millions of lives, that old man grabs the kid to sort of shield him from the blast. They embrace, and they're both obliterated, but it is kind of a moment of unity and kindness that I think had some real emotional weight to it.
It is important to note that this newsstand scene, the characters are all black instead of the newsman being white. It is in Tulsa rather than New York. And we have a little girl who shows up to pick up papers. To me, the most striking, almost a shot-for-shot reproduction of the film, which was almost a frame-for-frame reproduction of the graphic novel, is we get the character Looking Glass exhibiting very Rorschach-like behaviors. Rorschach shows up at Dan Dryberg's house in the movie, eating some beans, where he does that trademark pull-up of his mask just to the nose, and he just doesn't care about what he's eating. Here we've got Looking Glass showing up in Sister Knight's car, eating some nuts. Definite parallel there. If there was any doubt that the show was at least trying to mirror some previous influences, I think it was shredded right here.
Looking Glass really is my favorite character and the guy to watch in this show. It's my supposition that Looking Glass is really going to most closely mirror Rorschach in his attitudes and his applications throughout this series. For those who don't know, Rorschach is an analog or a character. He was based on a Charlton and then later DC comic book character called The Question. The Question was invented by Steve Ditko. He's also the creative genius behind Spider-Man, Fuck a Stan Lee. And he was sort of this costume adventurer without powers. He simply masked his face. He still wore regular street clothes. He didn't so much fight crime as expose criminal deeds to the public and to authorities. Frank Miller once wrote the character in a few panels where the character states, "It's not my power to effect change. I haven't the might. I'm not the answer. I'm only the question." Later, Steve Ditko would also create or independently publish a character called Mr. A, who was basically the same character, but a lot more stringent and violent. These characters they viewed all deeds as strictly black and white. They didn't show mercy or acknowledge extenuating circumstance. According to quote-unquote scholars, these two characters were objectivist libertarians in everything that they did and how they acted. And really, they were meant to kind of push Steve Ditko's own personal feelings out there about how he viewed society. Rorschach as a character is incredibly unyielding. He's very stringent. His personality made him an outcast, nearly homeless. He was filled with rage and governed by this violent desire to be draconian with his moral code. You know, he suffered this extreme hypervigilance, and he was just basically interested in expressing his views on society, how it should be, and kind of enforcing that view to the best of his ability.
Yeah, it's important to note that Rorschach, as we saw in the graphic novel, unlike all the other characters, did not seem to have a home life or any sort of leisure or anything like that. Like, you even notice, even the comedian, even though he lived sort of a solitary life, he was in his penthouse apartment, there was entertainment. He liked music. He liked having comfort. He liked women. If you look at even characters that were as isolated as Ozymandias, he enjoyed opulence and a degree of success. Rorschach didn't have time for any of that. It was strictly the job. And if you look at this character, Looking Glass, unlike other characters in the show, he seems to only live this job. He always kind of has a haggard look. He doesn't seem to have a partner, a family, anything like that. He's just this solitary, hyper-vigilant character.
But he does say, "I know you can't tell, but I am crying under here." Is that a nod to the audience that while I'm exhibiting similar behaviors to Rorschach, I really do care about and I do have empathy?
While I don't believe he is at the level of Rorschach in his sort of application, he definitely is a more factually driven individual. You know, I feel that he's more of a thematic descendant of this early Ditko creation. And obviously, he's not the action hero of this series. He's an intelligent man, but he doesn't speak like an educated man. He's their interrogator. He's cataloging facts constantly. He's breaking down scenes or events in a very matter-of-fact way. He does it without social graces. You'll recall in the car when Sister Night mentions her children and he challenges her on that. Earlier in that conversation, Sister Night asks him, do you think it was the cavalry? He doesn't say what he thinks. He says what is factually apparent. He goes, it seems to be the obvious assumption. So he's not giving any opinions. He's not sharing feelings aside from that little tiny give. I mean, he's strictly, what'd they say in Dragnet? Just the facts, ma'am. You'll notice after they lower the body, when they're all walking back to their vehicles, everyone else is walking back to brand new sports cars, and he's walking back to a beat up old truck. I think this guy just lives without frills. He's all business.
Getting back to the touch point of that tree where Judd Crawford was hung, I want to talk about another character that we saw at that tree, and that's Will Reeves. So in the opening of the episode, we get this historical look back to World War I. Will's dad is one of the black soldiers who receives this propaganda flyer that's dropped by the Germans. He keeps it, meaning that it had some impact on him. And when he writes that note to look after this boy and puts that note on Will, that's on that same piece of paper. Now, you could look at that a couple different ways. One is to say that Will's dad did make a deal long ago that's still being honored, some power that goes back to the turn of the century that is still intact. Or it could just mean that Will had that piece of paper his entire life and he learned a lesson from that sheet. Maybe he read it over and over and it gave him a different worldview that affords him certain advantages now.
I love how this show continues to introduce historical accuracies of our past and things that actually happened. So this is yet another history lesson. This did actually happen in both World Wars, not just World War I, but again in World War II, because until the end of World War II, and actually it really didn't take effect really until Vietnam, most of the American military was segregated. Units were divided into white and black. It really wasn't until World War II when Truman desegregated the military. The first real integrated war we fought, well, like I said, was Vietnam. I don't know if I believe that he struck a deal. I mean, it's an interesting concept and we'll see what happens. But if you'll notice, like, he did get spit on. So I do believe that he puts it in his pocket and he's probably reread that multiple times. But one of the interesting parallels that I found, and again, I know, B, you're not a fan of the big before Watchmen expanded comic book series that they released a few years ago, but the scene that we see in episode 1 of a young Will being put into the back of a wagon, and then as they're trying to escape the white KKK members, that's actually a lifted scene from John Osterman's origin story, where his parents were escaping the World War II Nazis because John Osterman's mom was Jewish. So they put a young John Osterman in the back of a wagon and were trying to escape through back roads, through backcountry roads. They're stopped by the Nazis. The mom runs. John's father, shoots the Nazis, but it's too late. They've already killed his wife. So I've found that interesting that they would lift that and bring it into the series. It's definitely probably the last thing he had in his pocket and the first most acceptable one that he had. I think it just happened to be that sheet of paper.
Well, the notion that it's Will Reeves' father that made this deal is especially interesting to me, noting that when they go to flee, that vehicle had a destination in mind. It knew where it was going. And I think that paper wasn't just the only scrap of paper laying around. It's a little too conspicuous to be just that.
So fast forward to the present time, and we see Will in a wheelchair. He seems pretty healthy for 105 years old. I mean, I think that Angela is incredulous about the fact that he is that old. And it was kind of one of the questions we asked early on in the podcast was, could he be Hooded Justice? Is this the same kid we're seeing back then? And I was like, no way, the kid would be over 100 years old. Well, apparently, he is. He's 105, and he seems to be a little something more than just the average man.
There's little things that you see that you really have to pick up on. Number one, when Sister Night brings him back to her bakery, she makes him a hot coffee or a hot tea. He immediately takes it and drinks it. The camera pauses on her and she looks befuddled. Like, how does he not feel any kind of pain from drinking really hot tea or really hot coffee? And then later on, he's boiling some eggs and he just reaches into a hot pot of boiled eggs and just starts, peeling up the egg and eating it. So I think there's little nods like this that tell the audience he can't feel pain. And I wonder if that, number one, is either a result of him fighting as the character Hooded Justice, or maybe that was his power, so to speak, is that he couldn't feel pain, a la
Darkman?
No, not Darkman. Who was the other kid? The kid who dressed up in green and fights crime.
Green Darkman?
But he can't feel pain. No, not Green Darkman. They made a movie about it. The guy kind of looks like, oh, come on, Kick-Ass. Kick-Ass.
Oh, Jesus. That shit doesn't exist in my world.
I liked Kick-Ass.
The second one had Jim Carrey.
So the only thing I would say that even makes Will seem not superhuman is A, he's in a wheelchair, which again, I mean, there are superheroes in wheelchairs, and also he's 105 years old. And also he says that he needs pills to get his memory going. What was interesting about that is he got the pills, then somehow he zips out of the room while Angela's gone and gets back. He could be just really good at escaping shit in a wheelchair. I thought the pills reminded me of like Our Man, who could take the Miraclo pill, and for an hour he had superhuman, strength and vitality, but then he'd go back to normal, eventually became an addict. That's a whole long, really interesting story. King B pointed out that he doesn't seem like he's not mentally there.
Yeah, I don't believe that these pills are for his memory. If they are, it's definitely a flaw in the performance, which I just don't buy. Throughout their interactions, he's always kind of fucking with her. He's not searching his thoughts or trying to recall everything. He's a sharp and cogent man.
Now, Raj and I just watched Iron Eagle for Shat the Movies, our sister podcast. Check it out at shatthemovies.com. And got to tell you, Louis Gossett Jr., not the greatest actor in the world. So it could just be a flawed performance, like you said.
I hope that he's gotten better with age. Because Iron Eagle was terrible. But yeah, no, I think it's more like with what B is saying. I think he's just fucking with her. I think that he wanted her not to think that he could get out of those handcuffs, which he obviously did. I think he wanted her to see that he could take down the T. I think he wanted her to find out that they're related. There's all these little nods that also are less obvious than just the revelation when she comes back with that DNA test.
And I think it's important to remember that in this world, because of the existence of Dr. Manhattan and Adrian Veidt, there have been a lot of medical and technological advances that don't exist in our world, despite the fact that they aren't internet and tech savvy.
Speaking to the whole fucking with Angela thing, though, Will clearly is not afraid of her. He's not intimidated in any way by this woman. He openly says to her, I mean, face to face, inches away, I'm the one who strung up your chief of police. He says that he's already given her the answers, but she just isn't listening, which, of course, for us doing the podcast, I'm like, fuck, all right, got to watch the scene again to see where the answers lie. I went over the scene 3 times. I didn't pick up anything other than the fact that he's saying he did it. And there's a conspiracy. So I thought maybe Will strung Judd up, but didn't kill him. Like basically he found the body, but wasn't the one who killed him. But Looking Glass clearly says that Judd died from hanging. By the way, how did Looking Glass inspect the body while it was still hanging? He's like, oh yeah, his trachea was crushed and yada, yada, yada. And I'm like, wait, he was hanging from a tree. How do you know?
If I'm going to answer it, I'm just going to say that his keen powers of observation, coupled with the fact that he was already on the scene well before Sister Night showed up, he's just already got the facts ready.
Not only that, I think he goes into great lengths of, yes, Judd died by the hanging, but he fought back, right? There are indications that there was fibers like underneath his fingernails. Like he gave some sort of resistance. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, either it was cut in the episode, because I definitely remember seeing it in the coming attractions, was Will saying, I didn't kill him, but I did string him up. I think more or less Hooded Justice, or Will possibly, came across the body and then hung him up for people to see.
It could be argued, just to muddy the waters in a podcast where you guys come for answers, that he knows all of these things because he perpetrated them.
Possibly, but why would you make him a bad character unless there is some sort of vast conspiracy that he wants everyone to know?
Who's to say that killing Judd makes him a bad character? We don't know Judd or his secret motivations.
Gosh, if there's only some sort of a thing that made us think Judd was bad to further muddy the waters. But the big revelation we get here, other than a Klansman's robe in a closet, is Will being Angela's grandfather. She discovers through a DNA test. He seems like he was pretty aware that she was going to figure that out. He says he's there to tell her that and also to show her his world. Not sure what to make of that yet.
It would make sense that if he's Hooded Justice, why she also wears a hood.
Me and Gene both wear socks. Did we come from the same woman?
Also, Also, the talk track of when Hooded Justice is kind of giving his narrative during the show. And he's like, in the real gruff voice, when I was little, every time I looked in the mirror, I saw a stranger staring back at me, and he was very, very angry. So who am I? If I knew the answer to that, I wouldn't be wearing a fucking mask. While that narrative is happening, it's overplayed the scene of Sister Night driving off in her Grand National to go get answers. So it would be the ultimate revelation if all of this was just a red herring. But I got to say, for me, all the hints are there that this is true. She really is his granddaughter, and he's Hooded Justice.
And this is where my big gripe with this episode comes in. The big reveal that he's her grandfather seems to be a little drawn out, considering the totality of all their exchanges. The whole "I'm giving you the answers, you just ain't asking the right questions" cliche in this instance doesn't add to the story for the characters. It seems that the reveal is just aimed more towards the viewer and making us go, "Oh no." But it just seems kind of weightless in this context. You know, the plot of the Wonder Woman movie could have been made into about a 20-minute film if Chris Pine had just taken 5 minutes to explain
rifles?
No. If he could just explain world politics to Wonder Woman for 10 minutes, then she would understand, oh, we just can't march over there and do what we want because of nations. It seems like he didn't have to stretch this whole thing out across a day and really drive her nuts with all this quizzical stuff. He could just say, hey, listen, I'm your grandfather. I'm working with this group of people. We're doing this because this is what's happening in the real world.
You mentioned the big reveal being that he is her grandfather. I think the other big reveal that happened with regards to Will Reeves is the fucking flying sky crane that picked up a whole goddamn car. It does make it super clear that Will apparently has friends in high places. You got to ask the question, is Will being played? Is he being played by a bigger force? Did he make a deal with the devil? If so, and I mean that metaphorically, if so, why is he trying to alert Angela to this insidious conspiracy? You know, he mentions that clearly. And so he is a believer that something is amiss, something is awry, and he's trying to convince her of that. But I don't know if he's going about it in the best way.
Yeah, even Angela says, are you behind this? Are you trying to set me up? Are you the one who put the hood, the KKK hood and then Klansman gear in the closet? And he's like, what floor was it on? You know what I mean? Like just little clever things like that. So, I mean, I think that the fact that if he is in fact Hooded Justice, it would make sense of how he's been able to avert any kind of being locked up or living in the shadows. He's got to have some sort of, whether it's government or some other Watchmen like team keeping his identity secret. It's also giving him access to this great technology.
Well, every super team clearly has an experienced and wise elder statesman. It makes perfect sense that this would be it. If I'm going to hazard a guess, I think that there is some clandestine organization that's working outside of the Keene Act.
We see Angela and fellow officers after the death of Judd going fucking berserk on a bunch of trailer park people. The police brutality does rear its ugly head again in this episode, whether you believe that is justified or not. We do get to see it. And I believe the show is really trying to draw some parallels between the police brutality and vigilantism in general.
Yeah, I've asked myself a lot of questions whenever I see the police in action. There's these two extremes of practice. They have to ask for consent to record interactions. They have to request permission for guns as a defensive measure, never as sort of a first line of defense. On the other hand, no one seems to expect or need a warrant for arrest or interrogation. It's awful easy for Looking Glass to just call someone a terrorist and negate their rights as we know them. And I think a lot of it comes down to these masks that they wear. It's really a dual purpose thing here. It's stated that they wear these masks to protect the police from identification or future attacks, but they're also providing protection from accountability. We see these police are clearly more interested in revenge in this scene than information after Judd's death. Yeah, they're going to collect some answers, but first they're more than happy to beat your ass. I want to know how police are viewed by civilians in this world, and I'm really hoping to see more of those interactions.
I mean, they're certainly not viewed in a good way by the fine people of the trailer park. You see an intimidation tactic the police use. They basically say, hey, look, you cooperate, you walk yourselves in the paddy wagon. This is Red Scare, kind of talking to the crowd. And he says, if you don't, we're pulling down your statue of Nixon, right? This was a really big key to me in understanding the world that we're occupying here, because Nixon, obviously being a Republican president who was president during the winning of the Vietnam War in this world, the fact that they champion Nixon likely means that they disagree strongly with the Redford presidency, which means that the overall population of the United States, or at least the Electoral College, is in favor of Redford and liberal leaning. And maybe this is Lindelof's view of what a liberal dominant society would look like.
Yeah, and I think we touch upon that in the first deep dive of how in a liberal society, all the things like putting the major warnings in front of American hero story, like, oh my gosh, there's going to be, sex and violence and images of racism, and we apologize to the LGBTQIA plus. You know what I mean? Like, there's all these warnings, or you can't do real police work without going through bureaucracy, or someone like Panda, where he asks 4 or 5 questions and you got to get consent. Like, in a liberal society, as a progressive, certainly you want to watch the Watchmen, if you will, and make sure that there are safeguards in place. But does that come at a cost? And I think that that's what they're trying to say here is, if in a world where police cover their faces for their own protection, what sacrifices do we then give up as a society? And if there is a conspiracy at play here, led by a person who was in charge of the Tulsa police, all the puzzle pieces are falling into play, such as the White Knight, which basically eliminated an entire police force, right? Everyone resigned, so they had to start up new. He's promoted to a position of power. And then something like this happens that we see in episode 1, where against the bureaucratic hero, Panda, he authorizes lethal force, which is what you don't want. You don't want martial law to come down, because that comes at a cost of citizens' rights. So, yeah, I think they're for the people who were like, oh, it's, very, liberal in the first episode, this is showing how in a liberal society, this can backfire. And especially in Nixonville, with Red, on the police car with the microphone, antagonizing that crowd, it really feels like. Do you guys remember in the Watchmen movie and in the comic book, when Night Owl 2 and the comedian are paired up, and they're trying to squash a riot that's happening, where the riot is kind of antagonizing. The costume characters are like, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you. This is shortly before the Keene Act, and someone throws a bottle, and that gives the comedian the right to just start shooting indiscriminately into the crowd. Night Owl comes down, and he's like, what happened to the American dream? And he's like, are you fucking kidding me? It came true. To your point earlier, is this history repeating itself just from a different angle? And we're seeing it because Sister Night says, Red, you don't have to do this. We don't have to go in there. We don't have to do this. But given carte blanche, this is what will happen in authoritarian regimes.
Initially I disagreed, because I felt that in one instance, the riot's already in place. And in this instance, the police are inciting the riot. But given the dialogue that's shared between the characters, there's definitely parallels there. This is a police force that I think, because of these masks, they're not about right, they're about might. And they're just here to exhibit that.
The news vendor even jokes, because this is Redford's Libstapo, right? Even Sister Night says that as she's talking to Topher, the world isn't all pretty rainbows. You and I see for what it really is. It's black and white. And this is very close to a Rorschach quote pulled from the comic book and from the movies. So it's interesting that, again, in this world, this supposed utopia, the same issues that plagued, 40, 50 years ago will repeat themselves.
So Judd Crawford's death sparked this sort of riot at the trailer park, or at least the police coming down on the people they suspected, 7th Cavalry. But another side to Crawford's death is kind of the aftermath with his family and people he knew. And it gives us an opportunity to explore his home through the eyes of Sister Night as Angela goes to kind of pay her respects. Yeah,
I really like this scene, because not only does it give us more insight into behind Judd Crawford and things that were set up in episode 1, but I think it also shows that Sister Night is not just this badass vigilante that puts on, an outfit and goes and kicks ass, right? It shows that she does some real police work. And I like the fact that you mentioned they're utilizing previous tech. Like she puts on the night owl goggles and she's exploring that closet. Now, there's two theories that come to play here. Number one, is Judd behind all of this? Or is Judd covering up his past? Meaning, one could argue that he's the one that set forth the White Knight. If he's a captain, he would have all the addresses for all the police force. He would know that when or where they would be at home. And in that scene where you see Cal and Angela, right before Christmas, right before the White Knight comes in, you actually see that whole backstory, which I thought was really well executed. There's a second member, a mass member. She kills the first guy, but the second one, you don't see him doing anything. The only thing that you see is her eyes fading to black, and then the next person she sees is Judd. Now, if you believe that Judd is behind all this, it would make sense that he would be the one, possibly in mask, and he wants to control the narrative if she's one of the few surviving people that we see.
The White Knight story definitely doesn't line up correctly. There are parts of the story intentionally left out. So we see at this point that although it might have been racially motivated, or at least under the guise of a racial motivation, it was really anti-police. And it would, Raj, make a great way to kind of cleanse your force and put people in place that you want, or at least cause enough chaos where you can kind of grab the reins. So again, 40 police officers' houses hit in the same night. Now, Angela does call them those racist fuckers. But again, that could be the intent of what Judd wants her to believe, or what the organization itself wants people to believe, right? Which is, again, not to say that the 7th Cavalry isn't racist. I mean, obviously, K on the cavalry is a pretty good hint. But there are questions left to answer. Where was Cal? Like, he was in the house. And so, therefore, if he wasn't killed, what did he see? I don't think he's the one that rescued her. Maybe he was. And then, again, who was that second gunman? Was it Judd? Was it somebody else that was sent? Now, I will tell you guys that if you're ever going to cleanse the rest of the police force and save me, please don't shoot me with a shotgun, because it's not a real good way to guarantee that I'm going to live.
In the belly.
And spray my guts all over the kitchen.
Yeah. He's the one, like I said earlier, who ultimately gave the authorization that possibly paint the police as authoritarian thugs, and maybe possibly paint the 7th Cavalry as victims, right? Because once the news breaks that, this police force goes in and is roughing up children and kids unprovoked, right? Which side of society is the general population going to agree with, right? They're probably going to agree with, oh my God, they came into their homes and, look at these thugs, and it's going to cause more people to riot. So maybe all these things he put into place. Also, we talked about this last episode. He lied to his wife and said that he was going to have one of the other officers drive him. Where was he going to? He was also really adamant about making sure that plane, there were no survivors. So again, if he's the one behind this all, there's evidence to support that theory. Now, let me explore the second theory. What if he's not behind this? What if he is just a pawn in this game and he is being played? One theory that's come up is, remember that picture that we saw of what seemingly could be a young Judd with a police officer? We think there's some sort of family connection there. I think we can all agree on that somehow. Now, in the first episode, the camera, when Will's parents are fleeing during the riots, there is a KKK Klansman member that the camera holds on. We don't know why. It's never really fully explained. That Klansman's robe looks eerily similar to the robe that was in or behind the closet in that hidden doorway. Could that be his grandfather or father, and he was just hiding it?
Listen, I was about to call you a bonehead, but then I did recall that when Will's mother raises her rifle, the father pushes the rifle down and says, "Don't shoot." And that's when it references that particular individual. I will, however, say that pretty much all Klan robes look the same.
Yeah, I don't think Klan fashion's changed a lot in the last 100 years.
No, but there's a sheriff's badge on there. That sheriff's badge could also relate, because we know it's not Judd's sheriff's badge, right? We saw Judd's sheriff badge in episode 1 where the blood, it's near the body. So this is someone else's badge. The only person that we know that would have a badge that would be in the closet would be possibly a family member's, which could be the guy that we saw in the episode 1. So this makes more sense. Plus, we haven't seen the KKK. We've only seen the 7th Cavalry. Now, there are some other signs that point to really Judd does have some sort of connection, because if you notice, there's only white people at this party. And I think Angela, we're supposed to see that because we see that from Angela's point of view. There's only white people. There's no other minorities in a town of Tulsa, right? And there's some pretty powerful people in there. There's a connection to Joe Keene Jr. We talked about him earlier in the podcast. We learned that the wife used to work for his office. And this is where we see the artwork in the house, the title of which is very close to the episode name. The real title of the artwork is Comanche Feats of Martial Horsemanship. The title of the episode is Martial Feats of Comanche Horsemanship. So martial means war, right? So war feats of Comanche horsemanship. Now, what Comanche horsemanship is it's something that was learned in practice by every young man in the tribe, by which he is able to drop his body upon the side of his horse at the instant he is passing an enemy to be screened from his enemy's weapons. So he kind of lays in a horizontal position behind the body of his horse, effectively shielding him from his enemy's view sights. That could mean a couple things, right? You're blinding your enemy so they can't see you. So what do? You would put on a mask like the KKK did, or you would blind your enemy with propaganda like in World War I and the Germans did. There might be false flags. We talked, they were talking about this at the Newsstand. It could allude to the teachings of his family and the KKK, and it's maybe something he wants to hide.
All right, Raj, another thing that you dove deep into for this episode was Ozymandias, Adrian Veidt, and what the hell is going on with his reality. I think people are very in the dark. They're begging for answers as to what is going on with this guy. And it's probably the most disconnected part of the show. Got any explanations?
I'm going to put on my Ozymandias tinfoil castle hat and give my opinions. I don't know if this is all true. Number one, I thought it was really cool. How do I say this? Bucephalus? Bucephalus?
I believe it's Bucephalus, yeah.
Bucephalus. That was Alexander's the Great's horse. We know that Ozymandias is a big fan of Alexander the Great, so it only would make sense that he would name his horse that. I thought that was really cool. Did you guys notice in the episode that we saw here, Topher is building what I don't know if it's like an advanced floating Lego castle, then destroys it? That's actually Ozymandias's castle that he's building.
It was weird because I was like, is this kid exhibiting some sort of a psychic power, or is this the future and you can just make Legos that float?
Well, if you'll notice in episode 1 where we kind of see the camera of the Dr. Manhattan cam or whatever on Mars, you know what he's building and destroying? Ozymandias' castle. In the background of Topher's room, there's a reproduction of Salvador Dali's The Persistence of Memory, which is the melting pocket watch painting. Now, considering John Osterman's and now Ozymandias' love for pocket watches, this could be significant, especially when paired with the apparent affinity Topher has with the dwellings or constructions of both characters, right? Now, why the two candles? A lot of people are supposing, and I might be on board with them, that we're seeing two different time frames a la Westworld. So last episode, we saw him blowing out candle 1, celebrating his first anniversary. In this episode, we see the second anniversary. Now, we assume that it's just one day has passed, but could this be different years?
Makes sense. He just wrote a play. A year later, they performed that play. You had to get the stage props ready to burn people.
Well, you also pointed out that in episode 1, which is seemingly the current time frame that we're mostly talking about here, anything outside of Ozymandias, there's a headline that we quickly pass by that says Veidt is finally dead. And if Veidt dies, it would make sense of why there would be some sort of Lego castle that kids could build, why Dr. Manhattan would be building a castle in memory of his friend Ozymandias, right? Who's the only one who knows the true secret, but then is destroying it. It would make sense that we're seeing two different time frames, that the Ozymandias is happening in a previous timeline, and he's the one that's truly setting all these things up in motion because, Gene, as you pointed out at the top of the podcast, history is repeating itself for a message. Other things that we learned when he pulls up on the horse and he eats one of his delicious genetically modified tomatoes. That was, again, another nod to what we did assume in the first episode, which is his servants, his maid, and his butler are genetic clones. We did see that. The actors are all props in his play. And there's a couple little different nods, like the music on the violin is the same music, Flight of the Valkyries, that's played during the Snyder Cut when Dr. Manhattan is killing all the Viet Cong. And he does say to his props that nothing ends, nothing ever ends. This is Dr. Manhattan's last words that he spoke to Adrian Veidt before departing to Mars. And the stopwatch that he pulls from the dead hands of the burnt crisp hands, it's 9 minutes to midnight. There's 9 episodes of this show. It has only just begun. And it's an allusion to the Doomsday Clock, which is going to be the destruction of the world. So there's all these little things that are happening. I think what I could take away with it is that we're seeing a previous time frame, and Ozymandias is the one that's setting all this up.
An interesting thing to maybe keep an eye out for, when the book was published back in the day, one of the first little, I hate to use the term, but Easter eggs that existed was as one issue would end, there would be an element in the final panel of the book that would also show up in the first panel of the following issue. So it could be something where as we're just transitioning between settings or maybe even times, although I doubt it's a timeline thing, that it's just an artistic choice to have this element recur, from one setting to another.
I'd also like to point out that I completely mispronounced the horse's name. It is Bucephalus. So for all the Greeks out there offended, I was trying to go with like more of a Latin with the C, but it says Bucephalus.
Greeks and the Latins didn't care for each other.
Bucephalus and the cavalry rode to Calgary to fight the Calvinist cabal.
Hey, King B.
All right, a couple other odds and ends before we get to the listener mail. We did learn through this episode that the reparations might only be paid to people who are directly impacted by racial violence and their descendants. This is really interesting because I've had this conversation about reparations with several friends, and people always ask the question, well, how do you determine who to pay, right? Like, is it by their blood quantum like they did with American Indians? How would you determine that? What makes someone black? And in this show, it appears that it's not just that you're black, but rather they do a DNA test on site, in this case at the Cultural Center, and that is how they determine who gets reparations.
Additionally, it's also location-based. So if you were related to someone across the country who was maybe involved in a different racial violent incident, you had to apply at a different place. So there may be people who just aren't cataloged at all that don't receive these benefits that maybe they should.
I mean, of course, there would be some layers upon layers of bureaucracy. You would have to imagine if this is called reparations, that this is money set aside by the federal government, but is dispersed at the state level, like most programs by the federal government are. So it would make sense that this would happen in a local cultural center in Tulsa. One Easter egg, just to add on to that, Gene, did you know who that she was talking to?
I couldn't place it. I know this guy. I've seen him before, but it just didn't come to me.
Fans of PBS will know that is Henry Lewis, or better known as Skip Gates. He's an American literary critic, teacher, historian, filmmaker, and public intellectual who currently serves as the director of the Hutchins Center of African American Research at Harvard University. He also produces and hosts a series that was on PBS on the history and genealogy of prominent American figures called Finding Your Roots. It combines the work of expert researchers in genealogy, history, and genetics historic research to tell guests about their ancestors' lives and histories, which I think is a great Easter egg for something like this. I'm glad that he was brought on. I'm glad that, again, the people are doing their fucking homework on the show, and I really appreciate it.
Speaking of that lineage and ancestors, you may have noticed that Angela's children are not the same skin color as she is. As King B mentioned, Looking Glass referring to your kids as if to belittle Sister Knight's legitimacy as their parent. There is this old man who comes to visit the house, and Cal's kind of hiding inside with the kids. There's a boy and 2 girls. The boy is named Topher. And in this episode, we discovered that her partner who was killed during the White Night was also named Topher. So I was wondering if these are his kids.
I do believe those are dead partner's children, almost 99%. And that old man, I had to look this up on some other sites. I think it was Vox or Vulture, their recap, where they explained that that's the grandfather, which I guess would make sense of why he would have visitation rights.
He also played the great Whitney Ellsworth in Deadwood.
That's true.
Ah, interesting.
And he's the guy who sold Walter White a machine gun in Breaking Bad.
Interesting.
Reconnoitered the rim, automatic fire on a whim. We do this all night.
Mothman news reporters. This I thought was a great nod back to the evolution of flight technology that former Minutemen member Byron Lewis, better known as the Mothman War. The last we heard in the Mothman, if you read the book or watched the movie, is that he suffers a nervous breakdown, was institutionalized. The reason that he suffered a breakdown is that he was definitely afraid of flying. He was afraid of this technology. So later on, he would drink heavily. And that's why he was kind of all crazy. Another thing, did you guys catch that the German typist in the beginning was called Frau Müller? That's the same last name of the strongman Rolf Müller, who people thought was the Hooded Justice.
To be fair, that's like half of Germany, though.
That is true. During the Christmas celebration where Angela and Cal are dancing, he looks up at the clock and says it's 2 minutes to midnight. That's another reference to the Watchmen comic book. Did you guys catch that Banksy style artwork of sexual embrace? As Sister Night is pulling away, there's this artwork now in the comic books that is displayed as graffiti by the Top Knot gang. That's actually a reference to the Two Lovers, which was a silhouette left behind by the Hiroshima atomic bomb, the atomic bomb that landed on Hiroshima. So a nice little nod back to the comic books. The Ghost, Pirate, and Owl plane, that's a nod back to the Black Freighter and Night Owl. And then if you noticed, again, I apologize, Watchmen is my life these days. King B, you brought up a great reference, and I think this is what they're trying to evoke here, is if you notice, every scene they're sprinkling in a little bit of blue. And I wonder if this is previewing Dr. Manhattan's ever-looming presence throughout the series, and kind of like, what it would be like to live in a world where there is this Superman that can do anything, but he lives off world and you don't know if he's ever coming back.
I think it's time to get to our mailbag. Again, if you'd like to write into the podcast, just write to host@shatontv.com. We'll try to get you on the podcast as best we can. And we had a good bunch of mail coming in this week, starting out with an encouraging note from listener Lucas, who wanted us to know not to subscribe to cancel culture or worry about it. And Lucas writes, boys, I love all Shat on stuff and have for years. I love Lindelof, both Lost and The Leftovers. So, of course, I'm going to be all in on Watchmen and your podcast. I'm hopeful about the show, but I have 100% faith your podcast will be entertaining either way. I just wanted to comment on not so much the political themes of the show, which are cool and I'm sure very multi-layered, but on the masses' future assessment of it and the impact it'll have on you all. I just want to let you know that regardless of how many people cancel you in the next few weeks, I'll still love you regardless. Make the 7th Cavalry anything less than mustache-twirling villains, woke Twitter will explode about normalizing evil or something, like the Joker movie. Make anyone who's against reparations evil, regular people are going to lose their minds. Promote the idea that cops need more oversight, conservatives are going to freak. Enjoy the minefield, Lucas.
I once had a boss come to me and ask me if I enjoyed having a job and how I would feel if I were to lose my job, as sort of like a motivational tactic. And I looked at him dead in the eye and I said, I didn't have a job when I got this one, and I'm sure I won't have a job before I get the next one. I don't worry about it too much.
I think we knew going into this that we were walking straight into a minefield, like you indicated, Lucas. And I think it's okay. The scary part about this show is that you run the risk of pissing off everybody, as Raj alluded to, because right here we have an authoritarian government that is liberal leaning, but then you've also got the resistance, which is sort of, I would say, that rugged individualist mind frame, which also is bad because they're being cast as villains. So we kind of are fucked either way.
It would make sense of why they would introduce the character like the Red Scare that would be giving that speech if they're really truly trying to mirror authoritarian left-leaning states. Why a character like the Red Scare who says, I'm not a fucking Nazi, I'm a fucking communist. Authoritarianism is bad, guys. Totalitarianism is bad. It's one thing we can all agree on, whichever fucking aisle of politically you lean on.
Thanks, Lucas, for your email. We had another email that came in from Dan in Vancouver, who pointed us to Peteypedia. And if you haven't checked out Peteypedia, if you go, you can just Google Peteypedia or go to the HBO website for Watchmen. And Peteypedia is basically this, it's like a wiki that's put together by this fictional person, Agent Dale Petey of the FBI. It unlocks a lot of the mysteries of the show, and I'll refer to it a couple more times as we go through these emails. But in it, I discovered something very interesting, and that's that there was this technophobia that was kicked into overdrive by the psychic squid that ended the graphic novel. So as the world came together after the psychic squid attack in New York, it was the same time that a bunch of new technologies were being invented. And so people thought that the squid, according to Peteypedia, people thought that the squid was brought about by these new technologies. So they were just like fucking destroy it all. So like, that's why you don't have cell phones, the internet. So essentially Peteypedia, go check it out. There's a lot of information in there. So thanks, Dan, for linking us to that resource. Following up on Dan's email, we have one from Renee Jimenez, who writes in about spark hydrants and lithium batteries. I found this one very interesting. You know, we were puzzling over the lithium batteries that are being collected by the 7th Cavalry. Renee wrote in, on the Watchmen episode 1 review, at about 34 minutes, Raj muses that the technology they have may come from an aftermath of the Cold War ending or Dr. Manhattan's research, which was on tachyonic particles. In the graphic novel, there are a lot of references that Adrian Veidt developed this clean, renewable energy system that was called energy hydrants or spark hydrants, which were key in building the fortune of Veidt Enterprises. This leads me to a little side note where I think it gets interesting. From the wiki, it says, this technological advancement was made possible through the synthesizing of lithium through the superpowers of Dr. John Osterman, aka Dr. Manhattan, to change molecules to different molecules. These hydrants, meaning the spark hydrants, are seen throughout the world and have a signature lightning bolt with a circle on them. Remember what the dudes from the 7th Cavalry were picking off from old watches? The old kind synthetic lithium watch batteries, which made people sick. I wonder what these guys are trying to replicate.
It's either crude communication that will allow them to link up with other members that are sympathetic to the movement, or it could be used in their bomb-making devices that they're utilizing. You see the 7th Cavalry creating the bomb, like a suicide bomb vest. I wonder if they have to get the lithium batteries in order to make that work.
Well, they make passing reference in the show to creating a cancer bomb. And I know that one of Adrian Veidt's evil plots was in order to subvert or chase Dr. Manhattan off the planet was to, essentially give cancer to those who had interacted with him quite a bit. It seems to reason that they're trying to replicate this technology with their cancer bomb.
And that ties into what we discussed on episode 1, which is essentially we've got all these vehicles that are running on clean energy. How are they doing it? It seems that they're being fueled by these spark hydrants. And Peteypedia goes into how technology is being brought back into the world. So again, in 1985, we have the squid attack. In 1993, there's something called the Tech Recall and Reintroduction Act of 1993. And what it did was granted the President of the United States, Robert Redford, authority to draft federal employees into the work of reintroducing technologies that were deemed unsafe or illegal. So there's a 30-year plan, mind you, 30 years from 1993. And it's got 5 stages. And basically the idea is that they're going to have federal employees as a part of being a federal employee. You're supposed to use tech to kind of prove to the rest of the country that it's safe to use. Agent Petey writes in the Peteypedia that computers, phones, and the towers that would have provided communications without wires were destroyed. And they were hoping that would save everybody. But yet these baby cephalopods, the baby squids, are still raining from the sky. So it seems that they've realized that even destroying that tech didn't help at all. So why not start, reintroducing it?
Do you think that they would keep like a federal employee like Petey out of the loop if there truly was this mass conspiracy that these world governments, this new world order, so to speak, that Ozymandias propped up after the events of the first Watchmen book? Do you think that this new world order would keep it away from federal agents, or do you think he would be in on it?
Oh, yeah. I think there's definitely a chance that dude is not aware. I mean, they named him Agent Dale Petey. It's called the Peteypedia. I don't know if we're supposed to take it all that seriously. Thanks, Renee, for your email. The next one comes in from Dawn Sauce, and this one's for Raj. It says, it's cavalry, pronounced like cavalry, the mobile military force, not like Calvary, the place where Jesus was crucified. But keep up the great work, and welcome back, King B. And some early tinfoil. It wasn't Don Johnson's KKK shit. It was his wife's. I'm throwing this one out there only because Don Johnson's affection for Regina King, who plays Sister Knight, seemed genuine, and an organization that calls itself the Cavalry instead of Calvary is being deliberately racist and not merely libertarian. Regina King, so Sister Knight, her husband noted that Don Johnson's wife sounded fine on the phone after Don Johnson got hanged. Also, hanged is the proper past tense for the act of stringing a motherfucker up, not hung. Gene, the journalist, are y'all just letting Roger decide how to say things now? Just like Regina King, just because their affect wasn't the same doesn't mean they were both affected the same way. And because Jean Smart, the actress who plays Don Johnson's widow, is a beast, see Fargo season 2, and I expect the writing team to exploit her talents more fully than merely the role of grieving racist widow. Then again, Regina King was spared, and her talk with Don Johnson after she came out of the coma seemed off. Then again, maybe Don Johnson was part of a bigger conspiracy involving false flag operations against his own force in order to coax the government into allowing police to go around in masks, a move straight out of Ozymandias's and possibly Louis Gossett Jr.'s playbooks. I think I better stop now.
I love this email. I love it so much. A lot of great grabs. And I agree that the widow is an excellent actress, and Fargo season 2 is one of my favorite pieces of television work of all time.
This is a comic book Westworld. There's all these theories, and I like that they're doing that, and I love the engagement from the audience. I do have to disagree with his assessment that it's her robes, because why would the badge be there? I mean, there's too many connections between the badge and the photograph for it to be her. Although I do believe that she does have some sort of leadership role in there because of her connection with Joe Keene Jr., the fact that she worked in the office, and as you pointed out, Don, that she seemed a little too unsurprised that Don died. I think that maybe she's the one who was behind the killing of Don Johnson. That I can get on board with.
I like that one email from Don, and we're suddenly just calling Judd Don Johnson now.
Judd, sorry.
No, I mean, this goes back to Shat the movies, where it's just like, it's just so much easier to just call the actor by their name. And I think all movies and shows should just start doing this now. Just, he's Don Johnson.
Yeah, it's a Donaissance.
Thanks, Don Sauce, for writing in. We had a quick question from listener Frank, who said, I'd like to thank you guys for a great first episode of the show. Thinking back about the differences in technology between our world and the world of the show, I was puzzled how, if there's no internet or cell phones, how are they able to get satellite feeds from Mars? Any insight would be appreciated. I'm assuming because really it looks like the technology that's not being used is not being used because consumers don't want it. And in this sense, a satellite feed has really nothing to do with any of the other two things.
Yeah. I mean, there's television, right? There's satellite feeds. So it makes sense of why there would be a satellite feed pointing up to Mars. I think they have some sort of orbiting satellite above Mars.
Aha.
Keeping an eye on Mars to catch those little blue candy bars. It's a wiener joke. Okay,
we got one coming up for King B, who needs a slap on the wrist right about now. And it's an I'm actually from Cal in Minnesota. And Cal writes, hey guys, this one's for King B. I think people feel a tendency to defend Rorschach because he's kind of a Wolverine or Batman of the bunch. But actually, Rorschach in the comics was very right-wing. He talks about a gay superhero being murdered for her sinful lifestyle. And the scene in the movie where he puts the meat cleaver in the kidnapper's head goes a little differently in the comics. Instead of chopping into the guy's skull, Rorschach sets the entire apartment building on fire and stands outside watching it burn and listening to the screams of everyone inside. White supremacists, and they are for sure white supremacists, would totally create a following around his manifesto. Love the show, guys. Thanks again. And that comes from Cal from Minnesota.
Well, I don't have any defense on the sinful lifestyle. He definitely did make that claim in the books. But I'm going to also say that due to the nature of his origins, his mother, was a prostitute and everything. I think he viewed any sort of sexual activity as sinful and ugly, and ultimately something to be ashamed of.
And another note, Cal, part of the podcast that you obviously don't hear is the pre-edit and the post-edit. So you only get the post-edit part of it. So King B and Raj actually went on for a while about the leaning of Rorschach and kind of how some of his, I would say, more conservative views that I did cut for length. So it was a little more balanced conversation than what you heard. So I'll take some credit for that. All right. Lots of great emails. Thanks everyone for writing in. if we start getting enough emails, we might have to break out a separate mailbag show like we've done for other podcasts. So keep them coming in. We'd love to read them. And if you didn't make the podcast this week, I apologize. We are a little bit over on time, so we'll try to get to you next week. That concludes this week's episode of Shat on TV Watchmen. Be sure to follow us on social media and share with a friend. We're on Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram at Shat on TV. On Facebook, just search for Shat on TV Podcasts. The website is shatontv.com. Again, you can email us at hosts@shatontv.com. If you'd like to leave a voicemail for us, you can call us at 914-719-SHAT. We'd love to hear your beautiful voices. And we're everywhere fine podcasts can be found, including iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Pandora, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe. And if you stop by iTunes, please leave a review. That helps the podcast grow. Even if you're going to give us a 1-star review because of our perceived politics, that's okay. It's a review. On behalf of my co-host, Roger Roper and the King Bee, I'm Gene Lyons. Be sure to join us next week for episode 3 of The Watchmen. She was killed by space junk.